Hello, and thank you for joining California State Parks Division of Boating and Waterways today. Over the next half hour, I'll discuss the process for applying for local assistance grants through DBW's coastal erosion control programs. I'll also talk about the types of projects these programs can help fund, and I'll explain a few key aspects of managing a DBW grant. All of us at DBW appreciate your interest in our grant programs and your interest in protecting California's iconic and ever-changing coastline. I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Casey Caldwell. I'm a project manager here at DBW, and I'm the program lead for our shoreline erosion control and public beach restoration programs. My contact information is on the slide, and I encourage you to reach out to me anytime if you have questions about DBW's programs, or just to talk about erosion issues your agency is facing. Staying in contact with coastal agencies like yours helps us to constantly refine and reshape and improve our programs. When you help us understand the erosion issues you're facing, you help DBW plan for the future of these programs. Here's a high-level outline of what I'll cover in this presentation. First, I'll introduce and discuss DBW's two coastal erosion control programs and some important differences between them. And then I'll explain the types of projects we can fund with grants through each program. Next, I'll discuss the grant application process, and this is a two-step process. First, a potential applicant agency sends basic information about a project to DBW in a letter of intent. After DBW evaluates that letter, if we find that it describes a project that qualifies for one of our programs, the next step is for the agency to submit a full application to us. I'll go over some of the specific requirements for both these phases today, but in this presentation, I'll mostly focus on the letter of intent, since that's the first step in the application process. Then, I'll discuss a couple aspects of managing projects funded by DBW grants, including how grantees receive funds. I won't discuss grant administration in too much detail today, but like most government grants, our funds do come with conditions, and we want you to know early on how our process fundamentally works. And then to conclude, I'll go over a few frequently asked questions. So let's get started with an introduction to DBW's coastal erosion control programs. And for those who are unfamiliar with DBW, I'll share some brief background about who we are. We were founded in 1957 as a division within the state's Natural Resources Agency, and we've gone through several renamings and reorganizations over the years. In 1969, one of those reorganizations assigned responsibility for statewide coastal erosion control to DBW for the first time. This move gave us authority to help local agencies combat coastal erosion using tools like beach nourishment, seawall construction, and everything in between. In 1999, the Public Beach Restoration Act created new statutes specific to DBW's participation in beach nourishment projects. And in 2013, DBW merged with the California Department of Parks and Recreation. And since then, DBW has been a division within state parks. As you might expect, most of DBW's programs are focused on issues pertaining to recreational boating. But our erosion control programs are also essential to what we do. DBW's mission statement is shown on the slide. The first part of that statement reads, to provide safe and convenient access to California's waterways. Coastal erosion control helps provide safe coastal waterway access, so it falls within DBW's mission. In addition, safe and convenient access to California's ocean and bay shorelines is a public right that's protected under the state constitution. And strategic protection of the shoreline is essential to protect critical public infrastructure near the coast. Don't worry, I promise I will not spend too much time on this slide. The list of authorities on this slide is not a complete list of all the authorities we follow in administering these programs. The point here is simply to show and to illustrate that we draw from many sources of guidance as we plan and execute these programs. Examples include state law like Harbors and Navigation Code and the Coastal Act, agency policy documents like the California Climate Adaptation Strategy, expert scientific advice like the Ocean Protection Council's sea level rise guidance, and executive orders like Governor Brown's order requiring state agencies to consider sea level rise when making investment decisions. I'll talk a little about the programs themselves, and first I'll talk about DBW's Shoreline Erosion Control Program. This program is established in the Harbors and Navigation Code, and the code defines the program's allowable activities pretty broadly. Through this program, DBW can provide grant funding for a wide variety of shoreline erosion control methods. And those include soft solutions or nature-based solutions like beach nourishment, like dune restoration, and hard solutions or hardened structures like seawalls and breakwaters and groins and oyster reefs. We can also fund combinations of hard structures and soft structures. DBW can fund construction activities under this program, and we can also fund pre-construction activities like feasibility studies and project engineering and design. However, DBW can't fund long-term post-construction maintenance and monitoring. That kind of long-term care is the local government's responsibility. And we usually can't fund routine shoreline surveys and studies unless they're being done in connection with an erosion or sediment management problem that's already been identified. Now, there is no dedicated state revenue source or ongoing funding source for this program, and no set amount of funding DBW gets for this program each year. The state can choose to make funds available for this program, but that discretionary decision is part of the annual state budget process, and there's no guarantee of funding in any year until it's included in a finalized state budget. Any funding that does get authorized is for specific projects that have gone through our grant application process. That structure actually creates some flexibility for the program. There's no limit to the number of projects or amount of funds DBW can seek funding for in any given year. There's also no preset minimum or maximum amount of grant funds available per project. Past grant sizes have ranged from about $50,000 for studies to about $3 million for construction. The actual grant amounts can be higher and can be lower. Grant funding through this program requires matching funds from the local partner. Based on statute and DBW policy, for this grant program, state funding sources can provide up to 1/2 or 50% of the non-federal share of costs. And that 50% includes both DBW and other state sources for that non-federal share. And if there is no federal funding for the project, the state can provide grant funds up to 50% of the project's overall budget. Again, when I say the state, I mean DBW plus other state agencies. There are erosion hotspots across the state where hard structures like seawalls are the most appropriate solution to a coastal erosion problem. And this program has funded successful seawall projects to protect public infrastructure at many locations across the state's coast. One such project is a seawall at Memory Park in the city of Pismo Beach. The seawall is contoured to resemble its natural surroundings, and it has a shoreline access stairwell for public use built into it. Another recently funded project is this coastal erosion protection structure with a sidewalk to the beach built into it in the county of Santa Cruz. Both this project and the Pismo Beach project were constructed with a clear intent for the protective structure to blend in with nearby landscapes as much as possible and to promote the important state objective of public access to the coastline. So the second program I'll discuss is the Public Beach Restoration Program. Also established in statute, this program has a more limited focus than the Shoreline Erosion Control Program. This program assists with the engineered placement of sand on the beach or in the near shore environment, and it can support related activities like engineering and design and studies. However, we can't fund post-construction maintenance, and we also can't fund general beach condition surveys through this program unless they're necessary for the eventual construction of a specific identifiable beach restoration project or a strategic sediment management project. Looking at some factors affecting funding availability, a state fund called the Public Beach Restoration Fund is a source of grant funds for this program. However, there is no dedicated revenue source for this fund. So again, funding levels each year are unpredictable, and no amount of annual program funding is guaranteed. As with the Shoreline Erosion Control Program, there's no established minimum or maximum amount of grant funds available per year or per project. So again, that gives us some flexibility in what we can fund each year. And as for per project funding, as a reference point, in recent years, project grant sizes have ranged from about $50,000 for studies to $11.5 million for construction. So obviously a very wide range of funding amounts is possible. And again, actual grant amounts could be smaller or greater than those amounts. The match contribution requirement for this program is a smaller percentage of costs than that required for the Shoreline Erosion Control Program. Instead of DBW and the state funding 50% of non-federal costs, here, DBW can fund up to 85% of non-federal project costs. The local partner's 15% match can be provided as cash or as in-kind services if those services are part of the project budget and if DBW pre-approves using them to satisfy the match requirement. Examples of projects funded through this program include several long-term, periodically renewed projects in Orange County and San Diego County that are led by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Pictured here is one of them, the Orange County Beach Erosion Control Project, also known as the Surfside Sunset Project. This is a long-term beach restoration project that began in the 1960s, and since then has periodically renewed Orange County beaches from Seal Beach down to Newport Beach. A picture of construction from 2008 is on the left. and a picture of construction from early 2024 is on the right. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is the lead agency on this project, and DBW partners with several other local stakeholder agencies to pay for the non-federal share of costs. Over the years, DBW has also funded locally led projects of various sizes that didn't have federal involvement. Over the last couple of decades, DBW has helped with construction, planning, permitting, and studies for large and small locally led projects all along the state's coast. As I get to the end of my discussion of our programs, I want to mention one more category of strategic erosion-related work that has been funded under both of DBW's coastal erosion control programs in the recent past. Since the early 2000s, DBW has provided financial support and project leadership to federal, state, local, and regional government agencies to help them develop regional sediment management plans, or RSM plans. This effort has been led by the California Coastal Sediment Management Work Group, or the CSMW, which is a federal-state partnership involving many federal and state coastal stakeholder agencies. The CSMW is currently co-chaired by the Army Corps of Engineers and DBW. Almost all the populated areas of California's coastline are discussed in a regional sediment management plan that was prepared under the general guidance of the CSMW. So it's more than likely that your agency's area is discussed in one of these plans. DBW can support updating these plans and follow-up work based on these plans through the grant programs I'm discussing today. So if you're interested in how that would work, or if you're a local or regional agency with ideas about how to implement regional sediment management in your area, please reach out to me. I'll be happy to discuss. The next part of this presentation will go over the grant application process, including the letter of intent and the full application. The grant application process for both programs has 2 steps. The first step is a brief letter of intent, which I'll discuss more in a moment. When DBW receives that letter of intent from your agency, we'll review it and determine whether it describes a project that's eligible for grant funding through one or both of our programs. If it does, we'll invite your agency to begin the second step, which is the full application. The full application will be available online starting in November, and it will be due to us in early February. Please check DBW's website for the exact due dates for each annual grant cycle. This presentation is being recorded in 2024, and each year the dates can change. Before I get into the application process, I'll explain at a high level what makes the project eligible for grant funding through our programs. First and foremost, the problem that the project would address must involve coastal erosion at an ocean or bay shoreline. Inland erosion at lakes and rivers and other water bodies is outside our coastal erosion program's authority. Projects must be led by public agencies as a statutory requirement. The project's purpose must be to provide significant public benefits. Public benefits can come in many different forms. For example, avoiding the cost of repairs to key public infrastructure, or preserving low-cost recreation, or avoiding economic disruptions associated with coastal flooding. And projects must not only be beneficial, but they must also be necessary to address an erosion issue. So, for example, even if a project like widening a beach would be economically beneficial for a community, if the project's at a location where there's no erosion problem, it's not the kind of project that's within our statutory authority. And projects must also be cost-effective. In other words, it should be clear that benefits are likely to exceed costs over the long run. Coastal projects are investments, and we'll look at costs of implementation and future maintenance compared to project benefits, which can be measured in many different ways and over a long period of time. And for eligibility purposes, the calculus that we use is pretty simple. DBW needs to be confident that benefits will exceed costs, but that's it. Not that the benefit cost ratio will be some specific high ratio like 10-to-1 or even 2-to-1. Our programs are designed to foster partnerships. Our statutes direct us to actively seek out partnerships with federal and local agencies. And in almost every case, the projects we provide grants for are projects led by local or federal agencies. And our role is primarily to provide funding assistance and advice. And as previously discussed, DBW won't fund 100% of project costs. A matching contribution by a local partner is required. With respect to studies, these programs can generally fund studies to address specific erosion control issues or to help with regional sediment management planning. And finally, the Public Beach Restoration Program has that extra limitation that it can only fund projects related to the engineered placement of sand on the beach or in the nearshore environment. So now I'll get more into the letter of intent, and there are 2 main reasons DBW requires a letter of intent. First, we want to encourage agencies to initiate contact with us to discuss your needs and to consider applying for grants. Of course, you can always pick up the phone and call me before submitting a letter of intent or just to discuss your projects. The letter provides a simple way for your agency to tell DBW about your proposed project in an efficient, structured way and initiate the application process in a relatively simple way. Also, as part of our responsibility to actively seek federal and local partnerships, we're always seeking to improve our knowledge of current and future statewide erosion control needs. And finally, a note about what the letter is not. It does not bind the agency that submits it to continue the application process. So if you submit a letter of intent and then decide later not to proceed with our process for any reason or for no reason at all, that's totally fine. And as for what goes into the letter of intent, I'll walk through a key list of points in a moment, but first, fundamentally, the letter of intent that we require is designed to be a simplified project summary or fact sheet. The full instructions for what to include are on our website, along with a sample letter of intent that you can use as a template. Key points that must be in the letter include the location of the problem, and the erosion problem must be described in sufficient detail for us to understand why it's truly a problem. The fact that a cliff or a beach is eroding isn't necessarily a problem because state policy directs us to let nature take its course where that's practical. Interventions can be expensive and disrupt natural processes, so they should really only be undertaken when justified. We ask you to describe the solution your agency wants to implement or to study. It might be that you're early in your process and you're proposing a study where various alternatives for addressing a problem need to be considered and compared, like at the feasibility stage. And we like to help with this kind of study because a good feasibility study makes it a lot more likely that your agency will end up pursuing the most effective solution possible. And the letter of intent must also include a high-level cost estimate and a schedule estimate that we can use to assess whether it's the right time for your agency to seek funding through our programs. And we know that these estimates sometimes are very early and preliminary, and that's totally fine. Again, do the best you can. To submit the letter of intent to DBW, please put the letter on your agency's letterhead and email a PDF of the letter to me. We encourage you to send us your letter of intent as early as possible, and it will be before the mid-December deadline if you can. This gives DBW an opportunity to review it and to give you feedback. We may ask you to make adjustments or to clarify details before the deadline so we can verify your project qualifies for a program. Please keep in mind that all our application deadlines are firm, so the sooner you start working with us, the better. And please do not attach anything extra to the letter of intent or to the email it's attached to. Of course, you know, and we know, how useful maps and photos and letters of support can be. But a main purpose of the letter of intent is for us to review a simplified, brass tacks type of description of the project without a need to reference any external documents. Letter of intent won't be scored or ranked, so don't worry about being at a competitive disadvantage at this stage from not including extra materials. There's simply no competition at this point in the process. Once DBW receives your agency's letter of intent, we'll determine whether the proposed project is eligible for a grant through either of our programs, based on the factors I've already discussed. We'll also verify you're seeking funds on a timeline that makes sense based on when DBW grant funds will be available. Our programs are focused on long-term problem solving. They aren't emergency response programs. So if we cannot fund your project on a timeline that meets your local needs, it's best for us all to know that before you start working on a full application. If we do notice anything that doesn't fit our requirements or that's unclear, we'll let you know within 3 weeks after you send the letter of intent to us. And if there's still time before our December deadline, you'll have the option to amend and resubmit the letter of intent with changes. So now I'll switch from the letter of intent to the next step, which is the full application. Here's the general timeline you can expect for the full application, which must be filled out in DBW's online grant application system, aka OLGA. The deadline generally falls around February 1st of each year, and we encourage all potential applicants to start early on the full application. After the deadline, DBW staff will plan site visits in late February or March to verify information in submitted applications and to meet local staff. By April, by a deadline that will indicate in the application itself in OLGA, a fully executed resolution from your agency's governing board or council that authorizes submittal of the application must be received by DBW over email. Now, ideally, we'd receive that resolution concurrently with the application itself, but we know that's not always possible or feasible. Requirement, DBW won't waive it. Our deadline for receipt of the resolution is firm. And I highlight this because applicants occasionally forget about it, and getting on agendas requires advanced planning at most agencies. Now, the steps after that take a long time compared to many other state grant programs. And the timeline is one of the subjects we get the most questions about. And the length of time between application deadlines and funding confirmation is something you should consider carefully as you think about whether this program is a good fit for your needs. About 10 months after our site visits, and after lots of internal review processes happen within the state during the confidential budget development process, the governor's budget is published in mid-January, around January 10th. And that's basically a first draft of the coming year's budget. It provides some early clues about what may be funded in the coming year. 6 months after the governor's budget, after months of budget negotiations between legislators and the governor conclude, by the end of June, we expect the final budget will be announced. If the legislature and governor have agreed to fund any coastal erosion control projects through our programs, they'll be included in this final version of the budget. We'll notify you as soon as we can so we can start working on preparing grant agreements and getting you going on your projects. In total, all these listed steps take about a year and a half, which is longer than some potential applicants expect. It's important that you're aware of this timeline as you consider applying for a grant. I'll now briefly discuss what managing a grant from DBW entails and how we go about providing funds to grantees, just so you know a little bit about what it's like to work with us. After a project is authorized to receive a grant in the state budget, a few more things need to happen before grant funds become available. I'll start with a note about timing. As you plan and schedule your work, please keep in mind when DBW funds will start to be available. DBW can't fund any work that happens before we have a fully executed grant agreement in place, nor can we give match credit for expenses or in-kind services from before the agreement begins. Grantees frequently ask us if their past project costs, like if they self-funded feasibility or design, can be counted as match on a subsequent construction grant, and unfortunately the answer is no. After budget authorization for a grant is confirmed, DBW will prepare a grant agreement. This agreement will contain a scope of work specifying what project tasks are included as part of the grant. I'll talk more about the scope of work in just a moment. DBW grant funds are typically provided on a reimbursement basis. The grantee periodically sends a formal request to DBW asking for a specified amount of reimbursement for work the grantee has already paid for. These requests must be accompanied by supporting documentation, which are things like contractor invoices and proof of payment by the agency of those invoices. And we also need documentation of match contributions using similar forms of proof. We also keep track of the project's deliverables. When deliverables are documents like studies or like permit confirmations, DBW needs to receive copies of deliverables for our files. DBW will also verify progress is being made on the project through regular communication with your agency and through occasional site visits. And sometimes mid-project activities require DBW review and approval. For example, during engineering and design, if we're funding engineering and design, DBW engineers will need to periodically review the draft designs, typically at completion intervals of 30%, 60, 90, and 100%. We don't act as the engineer of record, but we do review designs to ensure the plans include what the grant agreement scope of work requires, and there aren't unexpected design elements that wind up not being compatible with the grant's purpose. At the end of a project, both the grantee and DBW must formally accept the finished product for us to consider the grant project complete. For construction projects, DBW will come out to visit the project site to verify completion before we provide final reimbursements. And for most projects, DBW will retain 10% of reimbursable expenses during the project. We can release that retention after the project is accepted as complete by both the grantee and DBW. The project's written scope of work outlines how the state grant funds will be used. It defines the tasks to be completed, the budget for each task, and the anticipated schedule for completing each task. Note that the project budget should usually include allowances for time-based cost escalation, inflation, should include soft costs like engineering during construction and inspection, and should include a contingency reserve when warranted, and a contingency is usually warranted. DBW must pre-approve all subcontracts for work that will be funded under the grant. We won't get involved in your agency's process for advertising and bidding, but we must review subcontracts before they're signed to make sure they comply with basic state requirements. These are things like mandating certain levels of insurance coverage and forbidding specified kinds of hiring discrimination, things you would expect working with the state. Since DBW grant funds are state funds, state requirements apply to how they're used. Change orders during a construction project are obviously common. Under the terms of our grants, change orders must be approved in advance and in writing by DBW, unless the cost of the change order is below a dollar threshold specified in the grant agreement. Note that even if change orders are reasonable, the overall DBW grant amount can't be increased without going through the whole state budget process again. So manage your project budget carefully and try to avoid the need for change orders by being risk averse as you initially plan your projects. If overruns for individual budget items come up during the project, DBW will require the grantee to demonstrate how the overruns will be paid for. DBW won't automatically reimburse overruns from the contingency budget. Sometimes using contingency is completely appropriate, but that reserve is for truly unforeseen events, not for convenience. Finally, I'll answer some frequently asked questions. First, how does DBW rank applications? So we don't score the letter of intent. The full application is scored based on criteria we publish on our website for each grant cycle. Those criteria are subject to change each cycle, but generally they focus on project benefits, strategic planning, cost sharing, and timeliness of the funding request. Next, on funding, we're often asked whether we expect to fund grants in the coming year and in the future. As I've alluded to, that's partially out of DBW's hands, but we strive to support strong applications for funding. There have been years recently when no grant funding has been available for either program, but in many years there has been funding. We don't know from one year to the next what the state budget for this program is likely to be. That's driven by a combination of how many strong applications we receive from agencies and what funding sources the state has available. When would funds be available? The answer is funds will be available about a year and a half after you first submit your letter of intent to DBW. It takes that long for project funding requests to go through the full application process, and then the site visit process, and then the entire state budget process. Can DBW provide those funds any faster, like when there's compelling need or an emergency situation? And unfortunately, we simply can't. This program is not designed to be an emergency response program, and it's really best suited for long-term solutions to known problems, rather than solutions where there's a pressing need to implement something addressing a fast emerging situation. What in-kind services can be used for match? The rule of thumb is if the service is part of the project budget, it can probably be credited, but if it's not included in the project budget, it probably can't. And we can only count matches contributed during the grant project performance period, nothing before then and nothing after. An agency near mine is applying this year. Would my agency's application affect theirs? The answer is it probably would not. If both applications offer strong benefits, we can pursue funding for both applications. The only nuance is if the two projects are somehow related, like if they're geographically adjacent, one would physically affect the other. If that's the case, I recommend you give me a call and we can discuss the best path forward. And finally, do other state agencies offer similar grants? So DBW's ongoing statutory responsibility for statewide coastal erosion control is unique in statute, but other agencies do occasionally have programs that overlap with that responsibility. DBW can't speak for those other agencies, but you can always feel free to reach out to me. And if DBW's programs wind up not being the right fit for your project, we'll see if we're aware of other current opportunities through other agencies that might be able to help. And so in closing, my contact information is again on the screen. One last time, I encourage you to call or write me to discuss coastal erosion issues whenever you'd like. The Division of Boating and Waterways appreciates your taking the time to watch this presentation. We're grateful that you share our interest in protecting California's coastal areas from the impacts of erosion, and we look forward to hearing about solutions your agency is considering. Thank you again, and have a great day.